easier part of Ezra chapter 2. And even there were still lots of names and numbers. And if you could, with your device or whatever, keep Ezra 2 handy, then that would be good. Because we are now in chapter 2. And you can see from the title earlier that is about people. But actually, if you look at the full text, and I know the text is small, so I'm just trying to give you a glimpse of the overall there. And if you look there, the first 60-odd verses is just full of names and numbers. So the passage is definitely about people. The people who came back to Jerusalem to live and to build God's temple. But despite those 63 verses or names, I think the underlying message is actually faithfulness. Foremostly, it's God's faithfulness to his people, and then a faithful response from the people. And it is firstly God's faithfulness, because he could just have left the people scattered in exile. You know, when there's a spouse who time and again went after other people, and now they finally have left, who would go out of their way to bring back a wayward husband or wife? But Ezra 2 here shows God would. Because again and again, God had told the prophets in exile, he will bring back his people. And we might say, God is God of the second chance. Or actually, though, it's more like God of the 2000th chance. And God even put a time frame to it, 70 years. And when the 70 years are up, suddenly an unexpected new policy pops out of the blue, and the pagan king says, go home, go worship your God. And 2 weeks ago, I said, actually, not many of the Jews did go back, maybe 5%. And even that was a generous estimate. Now, God was magnanimous, but most of the people were unmoved. Life in pagan land was just too comfortable to give up or to build God a temple. Now, how would we react? Now, someone has been completely and utterly wronging you, and after many years, you decide, let bygones be bygones, and you show extreme generosity, and they just blank you. How would we react? Now, press the button, zap the lot? But not God. He says, there is a remnant. Now, 95% might be immovable, a dead set, stiff-necked, a lot, but still, that leaves 5%, a remnant. And we might think, well, only 5%, is it worth the effort? But God will not give up on even 5%. God will work with even just 5%. And so we read in chapter 1, verse 5 last week, these are the ones whose heart were moved by God. And before we look at them, all those names in Ezra 2, it is worth just checking up ourselves. Now, do we allow our hearts to be moved by God? The 95% thought it was too costly or too risky to be moved by God. Too much to give up, so they stayed out and died in pagan land. So what about us? When we hear God, might we reason God away and thus be counted with the 95%? Well, God is not going to be put off by the fact that only 5% responded, because God is faithful to his word. He has said so, so it will be. God will gather and bring back his exiled people. Therefore, the redeem of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing, and everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. And even when only a small remnant shall be moved, God will still remain faithful to his word. Which is why Ezra 2 is such a testimony of God's faithfulness. God deserves the worship of the full company, all his people, not just 5%, but God is still nonetheless the same. God still acts and God still redeems, one by one. And if Ezra 2 tells us nothing else, it tells us God knows those who are his. Now, we might think this is such a long, tedious list of names. But if this is the list in God's book of life, now would we not be keen just to check that our name is not missing from such a list? And Ezra 2 shows that God does not miss a name. We're not just a statistic. God knows us individually by name. Now, almost all these names in Ezra 2 are nobodies to us, but everyone is known by God, so that even after 70 or 80 years from the event, and when Ezra starts to write these things down, and before Ezra even gets to tell the story, God gets him to list the people by name. And not just here the ones, but also later again in Nehemiah 7. God has not forgotten. God does not forget those who will be moved by him and are counted his. And God knows each and every one by name. And the names are listed in a certain order. Now, first, they are the leaders, and then there are the people. Firstly, listed by the family clans. And then the second lot of people are listed by their hometowns. And this is how God's people are characterized. Firstly, there is the family line. Now, out of one man, the one covenant, the one promise, came the whole family. And we, New Covenant believers, too are children of promise out of the one man, Jesus Christ. And secondly, the people are listed by their hometowns, their land allocation, their inheritance. Now, God's people are heirs, co-heirs with Christ, characterized by God's inheritance, an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade, kept in heaven for us. And so when God's people arrived at the promised land, now remember, these are the children born in exile, yet they belong in the land because they bear the family name and they have the inheritance rights. So when God's people arrive at our eternal residence, we'll belong, even though we originate from a foreign land, because we bear the name of God and we have our inheritance. And incidentally, all the towns mentioned here are those in Judah, the southern kingdom. So the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom who were exiled earlier and had a longer time to get established and comfortable in exile, well, they did not go back at all. So in the end, their inheritance just laid unclaimed. You know, that should be a warning for us. Inheritance counts for little when we have it at the start. Inheritance only matters whether we have it in the end, in eternity. And we see here, the longer we stay out of the realm of God, the more inclined is our heart to be unmoved by the call of God. And after this general community, then we have the group of people who are directly involved in the work of the temple, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. And if you total up this group and compare its size to the number of people above, we find that every fifth person returning is a temple worker, 19%. Now that's a lot of temple workers, especially when there isn't a temple, and there hasn't been one for 70 years. So one thing I think we can say about this 5% remnant is this. It was made up of a lot of people who were keen to get back to worshiping God. And considering that these are mostly people born in exile, who had never even seen the temple, then it says quite something about their parents, who brought them up in the knowledge of God, even as they lived in a pagan land steep in pagan worship, with just the first few books of the Old Testament. But one of the fundamental functions of a priest is to stand before God on behalf of the people, what we call to intercede. And that is still true, even when the altar and the temple have been destroyed and the people deported. And so, evidently, 4 of the 24 divisions of priests stuck to their God-ordained task. And when the time came, they came out in force. And there were more priests than people from any of the family clan or from any of the towns. Indeed, 10 times more priests than Levites, who were the tribe set apart for God to help the priest, taking care of the temple and its articles, performing duties for the whole community, is how it's put in Numbers 3. So in normal times, that ratio would have been completely the other way around. 10 Levites to help 1 priest. The priest is seen up front in the service, but there are lots of people doing the backstage preparation. But few of these backstage workers have come forward. Maybe they thought they ought to have a higher calling in life than gatekeeping or wick trimming or basin polishing. Maybe they found shopkeeping or banking or teaching more fulfilling or more in keeping with their new status in exile. And there is a danger for us here too, when we mix up what we think is our status in secular society with how we think people see us in church. You know, I employ 20 people in my successful business, and all they get me to do in church is hand out hymn books. We can see how these Levites might think. Why should I give up a successful, rewarding career only to go top up oil in temple lamps? But to think like that about ministry is to forget why we are ministering at all. Because we're not in ministry for ourselves, or even actually in the first instance for other people. We are for mostly ministering to the Lord. We are serving God. So it's not about what our allotted task is, but who are we doing it for? You know, we might only be wiping chairs, but we are wiping chairs in God's house. Now, we are wiping chairs for God. It is God we are serving. And this is perhaps better understood by that third group of temple workers, labeled here the temple servants. The ones actually who did the menial laboring. They would be like the Gibeonites who chopped wood and carried water. Now, they were not of Jewish descent, but they had been assimilated into the nation. Verse 55 mentions the sons of Solomon's servants, and many of them had non-Jewish names. So probably their forefathers had become war captives in Israel and eventually got absorbed into the community. So they're not native, not blood relations, but in some ways they were more Jewish than the Levites, because they came with 3 times the number of Levites, and then only to do the most menial of jobs. Indeed, as servants to the Jews through losing earlier battles, they were actually set free when the Jews were defeated by the conquering powers. They, of all people, did not need to go to Jerusalem, but they happened to once receive the rare opportunity to be partakers of God's grace. And they have been enlightened, and they had shared in the community worship of God, and they were not going to fall away now. To be a servant of God was much more important for them than to be a free man in a pagan land. So they were not going to lose out on their inheritance now. And what a testimony of the reach of God's grace that is. So even in the Old Testament, there was still room enough in God's grace for the outsiders who would be counted for God. So how much more now when God has opened up his kingdom under the kingship of Jesus, his Son. And now we come to the last section of names. And here we have some people and some priests who, unlike everyone else, they could not prove their lineage or ancestry. Now, they undoubtedly believed they were Jewish. You would not walk 1,000 miles with your family and all your possessions if you did not fully believe you belonged to this group of people. Ezra does not tell us the consequences for this people, but certainly for those who claim to be priests, they were excluded from the priesthood. Now, considering how small the numbers who returned were, and clearly you would be happy for every willing pair of hands to help out. And it's not as though they were short on land to share out. Then why are we so picky then about who's in and who's not? Well, mainly because it was not up to the people to decide the criterion. God determined it to be by birth, and there's supposed to be evidence. We don't simply take somebody's word for it, or simply because, they've been around for so long. We to look at the evidence of birth, and in the case of the church, evidence of new birth. No, we are born into God's family, or new birth. Now, Matt spoke last week of the meaning of the word church. And last week, he focused on the aspect of the physical building. But he also mentioned that there is the aspect of the people. So when Jesus said, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Well, of course, when Jesus said that, at that point, there was no church. No one would know what church is. Didn't exist. But Jesus actually used an ordinary Greek word, ecclesia. And Matt mentioned this word last week. And because it was just an ordinary common Greek word, then people who would understand what Jesus was talking about. The ecclesia, they would understood it as the gathered assembly of people who have been called out of a wider grouping. That's what the word ecclesia means in their ordinary language. So that is what Jesus meant by church. The gathered assembly of people called out of this world that we are in. And that was always God's way. We had seen some verses earlier of God speaking to his people in exile. And he said he would gather them and bring them back from exile. So he would call them out of exile so that they would be a gathered assembly in Jerusalem, in their own land, to worship God. This is the language of ecclesia. This was always God's way. And it goes all the way back, not only to when Jesus first used that word church, not even to when God called his people out of exile, and not even to when God called his people out of slavery in Egypt, but even to when God first called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans. This was God's design always. And it's been like this, to gather a called out people for himself. And we in Thornhill are no exception. So, it is not then just any old gathering or any loose assembly. It's God's gathering. He does the calling out. So it's on God's membership criterion, and it's by birth or new birth. And those Jews were switched on enough to check for evidence. And those who would be priests were especially checked because that was a leadership role. So these then were the rebuilding people, the ones moved by God to rebuild the temple. But equally, they're the ones living in the faithfulness of God to gather for himself a remnant, to rebuild a kingdom with that remnant. And these people knew the privileged place they held in God's redemption plan. And they, in turn, respond to God's faithfulness, such that when they arrived at Jerusalem and they saw the temple ruins and they saw the scale of the work, they were immediately making a free will offering. Oh, they were already provisions, actually, from their neighbors back in exile. And all the original temple articles have been brought back too. But the people here still wanted to make a free will offering right at the beginning with the heads of the families. And it says in verse 69, they gave according to their ability. And I made a rough calculation of what it was in today's value. I think it was about 25 million pounds in gold, pounds, money, currency. 25 million in gold and 2 million in silver. Per person, that's about 500 times what is typically raised in comic relief each year in the UK. That, I know it's not all about numbers, but it does show something of the nature of hearts moved by God, and it transpires in the people's giving. And the people also responded in worship. I've already said 1 in 5 of the people returning were temple workers. Worshipping God was clearly high up in the mind of these people. But the list also specifically highlights singers. And I said earlier, there were few Levites. But still, a third of the Levites in verse 41 were singers from the family of Asaph. And that's probably Asaph, the writer of 12 of the Psalms in our Bible. And verse 64 specifically mentioned 200 singers. Now, we often make the point that worship is not just about singing. True. But equally, Singing to God is all about worshiping Him, praising Him, exalting Him, magnifying His name, and giving God adoration. And when God assembled this team, He moved the people to go rebuild. And God specifically included singers and songwriters in that team. God was equipping them so that they could, not only in the worship service, but also in their day-to-day construction work, so that they could be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another with psalms and hymns and songs from the Spirit, and sing and make music from their hearts to the Lord, as Ephesians 5 would put it. And now, at verse 70, the chapter closes with what would seemingly be like just a throwaway concluding statement. It basically says the people lived in their towns. Well, of course, what else would you expect? Where else would they live if they didn't live in their towns? However, remember, for 70 years, these people had no towns. Most of them were born in exile, 1,000 miles away. They've only heard about their towns from their grandparents. But remember what God had promised through His prophets to His people in exile? That He will bring them back to their own land, to their own cities. And they will live in their own cities. Indeed, God Himself will plant them in their own land and cities. So verse 70 is not just a throwaway sentence. Verse 70 is saying, you know what God said He would do? Well, now He has done it. Verse 70 is telling us God is faithful to His word. The whole chapter is telling us God is faithful to His words. There are God's people once again in the towns of Judah, just as God had promised. And in bringing His people back, God was not only fulfilling His promises spoken through the more recent prophets in exile, like Ezekiel and Amos here, because there's also a certain prophecy made all the way back in Genesis 49 by Jacob concerning Judah. It was really a very bold prophecy because it speaks of a rulership, a reign in Judah. Now, Judah was not even Jacob's oldest son, but somehow Jacob was saying a kingship will be in Judah, and it will stay there until a certain rightful king comes along to claim it, and then he will have rulership over all the nations. It was a big, big prophecy way back in Genesis. And when the king was David, this sort of was looking a bit promising. But actually, 2 weeks ago, we saw that the kingdom split, and eventually Judah, the people, were carried off as war trophy, and Judah, the land, laid waste. Well, this was going nowhere. All through the exile, this verse here looked more and more unlikely until, just at the right time, God moves the heart of His people to return. And who does God move? Well, right at the top of God's list, we have there Zerubbabel. Now, Zerubbabel was the guy who led the temple rebuilding. He was never a king. So how does he help? Well, when we go to Matthew chapter 1, we see another long list of names, which is the genealogy of Jesus. And we see Zerubbabel right in the middle of it. When God brings His people back from exile, He was not just repopulating the land. He wasn't just reviving temple worship. God was restoring the lineage of Judah. Jesus could not become the Lion of Judah if Judah continued to lie in ruins and Zerubbabel remained lost in exile in Babylon. Jesus could not be born in Bethlehem if it remained a wasteland, like a jungle, with God's people scattered throughout the Persian Empire. But we see that God always had a plan, and he remains faithful to his word, even to a word spoken to as far back as Genesis. And Ezra 2 shows God gathering a remnant for himself and call them out of exile so he could rebuild Judah once again as a people of God, so that there could be a people for his Messiah to come to, just as he has promised. Exodus 2 shows how God remains faithful to his layer upon layer promises, even when he is faced with a 95% who would not be moved. Only may we be in tune and in step with God's moving and remain faithful to him to the end. Shall we stand to worship our faithful God? He is the faithful one. When he has spoken, he will carry out his word to the end. And even if it's only 5% responding to him, our God was still the faithful one. Praise God. Let's stand and worship him.